Hi everyone, Alexa here from the blog theduvallhomestead.com. Today I'm going to show you how to make a seeded whole grain sourdough sandwich bread. This pregnancy, for some reason, I have been craving whole grain. I've never not liked whole grain, but for some reason I never buy it, except for in this pregnancy. For some reason, whole grain just sounds really good. And I already have a sourdough starter. I already have a bread recipe. I figure, why don't I just change my flour up a little bit, because I've been making sourdough bread for a few years now with the same recipe. And it's fun to try something new flour, a new type of bread. So I was excited to experiment with this recipe before sharing it with you all here. Now, if you are completely new to bread making, this is a process that just takes practice. The steps to making the bread are very similar to steps to making most breads, maybe a little different, but it is the traditional method that I use with my regular plain beginner sourdough bread loaf. So if this is your first time making bread or second, I would suggest hitting up that blog post and watching that video, because there is some information in there that I may skip over because I've been doing this for a couple of years now. So if this is only your first or second time making bread, I suggest looking at my original bread recipe on the blog and YouTube channel just to get a little more experience and a little more visual. Personally, I'm a very visual learner, so when I first started making bread a few years ago, I watched a lot of videos because reading the instructions was just very intimidating to me, as there were so many, and there are so many. They're very easy. Every step only takes a few seconds or minutes, but it's understanding the general process of bread making, and once you understand the process, it's generally the same for every type of bread and loaf, and you'll feel a lot more confident and comfortable once you kind of memorize it. So don't be intimidated if this is your first or second time and you still feel like it's overwhelming. So you're gonna start by adding 3/4 cup fed active sourdough starter. How you know your sourdough starter is ready is it will be bubbly, kind of bouncy, springy. And how you know for sure is if it passes the float test. So what that means is you can take a spoonful in water and it will float. This is an important step to do because you want to make sure your sourdough starter is ready, especially if you are new to sourdough starter and you're not sure. So you see how it's floating there? That's how you know your sourdough starter is ready. If it sinks to the bottom, it is either not ready yet and needs to sit out longer, or it is overfed if it's been sitting out for too long or it's too warm outside, and you would have to start over at that point. Now that I know my starter is ready, I'm going to do about 3/4 cup of that active bubbly starter. Next, I'm going to do about 1.5 cups of water and 2 teaspoons of salt. Just going to whisk that together with a fork. And you should have a nice wet mixture here. We haven't added our flour yet. To that, you're going to add 1/4 cup of honey. And you can actually omit this if you want, but I really like the honey when it comes to whole wheat flour breads. Really helps to have the added sweetness. And 2 tablespoons of olive oil. I'm gonna use a nice extra virgin, organic if possible, olive oil. And whisk that together with a fork. Okay, so you're gonna add your flour here. This is going to be a nice 100% stone ground whole wheat organic flour. I'm using Bob's Red Mill, and I'm adding 3.5 cups of flour. Now I'm going to mix with my hands. I always take my wedding or my engagement ring off because the flour gets caught in the diamond pretty badly. So going to just do a nice mixing with my hands here. You can also use a stand-up mixer with a bread hook. I've done it before and it works just fine. I think in this situation I just didn't feel like getting another bowl messy because I don't like to use my mixing bowl to ferment it overnight. It's too big. So I like this bowl. This is my sourdough bowl, as I call it. So you should have a nice wet dough here. It should feel pretty sticky and wet. And I want to make a note that if you're using a different flour than me or you have a different water, there are variables that can change how your bread turns out regardless of the recipe you follow. So it's a general rule of thumb, in my opinion, that you'd rather have a more wet dough than a too dry of dough. So If you have to add a little more water, go ahead. Either way it will turn out, so don't get discouraged, but you will get the hang of it, so just keep going at it. So now I'm going to cover my bowl with a tea towel and let it sit for about half an hour, and then I will return to the next step. It's helpful to put this in a warm location, such as your oven or your stovetop, assuming it's not on, but it's just warm from your last meal, or maybe in front of a windowsill, somewhere that's gonna have some sun. You don't want it to be too hot, but a good 70 to 75 degrees is a great temperature for making bread. So I'm sure you've heard of like a Dave's Killer seeded multigrain bread. If you have that at your store and you've bought it, you know it's very good. And I don't usually buy bread because I make so much bread at our house, but the times I do buy bread are usually when we go on a trip, go on vacation, we're driving somewhere and we need some food for the weekend. I will bring my sourdough starter with me on vacation if we're staying somewhere for a while. But if it's only 1 or 2 nights, it's not worth bringing the starter to make the bread, and it'll be done by the time we're leaving. So I just go and buy bread, and it's kind of a fun experience anyway because it gives me a chance to try new bread, and everyone likes to try new things. The Dave's Killer seeded bread I think is so good. So I was hoping to create that myself for us in our home to replicate that with this recipe. Okay, so for the seeds in this recipe, I'm going to be using pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, chia seeds, and I'm also using rolled oats. This will give the bread a nice crunch, a nice little surprise when you bite into it. Okay, so you want to aim for about 1 cup total of seeds and oats. So I'm going to start with about half a cup of oats, about 1/4 cup of sunflower seeds, about 1/4 cup of pumpkin seeds, and I'm going to do 2 tablespoons of chia seeds. And give that a good stir. Okay, so after about half an hour, and that time is not super rigid, but it is an estimate, could be an hour, but you're gonna take your bowl off your counter, take a little peek, and this has given the dough a chance to lightly ferment. And now you're gonna add your seeds. And this is the stretch and fold or lift and tuck part. I call it lift and tuck in my original recipe because it reminds me of a workout plan where you're lifting and tucking. But anyway, you're going to lift and tuck each corner. So 4 sides total. You can give it a little wiggle. And you're just incorporating those seeds as best you can. You're also distributing the gluten in the dough as you're folding it over itself. And if there are seeds left over on the bottom, you just pick them up, put them in, stretch, fold, lift, tuck. Beautiful. And now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to cover it with our towel and let it sit, this time for at least an hour. Now, one thing to note about sourdough is your type of flour and your sourdough starter and your water quality and the temperature in your house all play a role in how your bread turns out. Even if you follow this recipe or another one to a T, your bread still may not come out exactly how mine comes out, and that's just something that you have to learn. And over time, you'll get to know how the dough should look. So I'm gonna try to include tips in this recipe on how the dough should look and should feel. So hopefully that's helpful. But just know that if something doesn't work out, it could just be that your flour is a little more dense than my flour or it's lighter than my flour, something like that, and you might have to modify. Experimentation is part of the beauty of sourdough. You're creating a science experiment with the yeast, active cultures in the sourdough. It's very fun, so enjoy that process and don't be afraid to try something else. Okay, so you're gonna repeat that process 2 to 3 more times, so for a total of 3 to 4 times. At least 3, sometimes I do a 4th if I have the time. But you're going to keep doing that lift and tuck or stretch and fold process around each side 4 times, about once every hour. I would say that's the minimum, but it's not like if you wait 2 hours, you've messed it up. So once every hour is the minimum. I like to go longer, so I'll probably do this again in maybe 1 hour, and then I'll do it another time 2 hours later, and then a last time right before bed. Right now it's about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, so I'll probably do it at 6 o'clock, and then 8 o'clock, and then maybe at 10 o'clock. At 10 o'clock, my time, or whenever you're done with this before bed, when you've done your last stretch and fold, you're going to cover the bowl with plastic wrap and put it in the refrigerator. This is for what is called the bulk ferment, so it's the longest time that the bread is going to sit without you touching it. and we're gonna put it in the refrigerator because that's how I've had most success. If you let your bread sit at room temperature for too long, it can actually over ferment. So the sourdough starter can get too hungry and starve, and that will kill the bread. So this method works really well. Putting it in the refrigerator, the colder temperature will slow the feeding process down of the phytic acid that's in the sourdough starter and allow you to have a really nice product in the morning. In the morning, you're going to pull this out of the refrigerator and you'll see that it has risen. You're going to let it sit out at room temperature for about an hour, depending on how warm your house is. I just like to do this so that the bread has a chance to loosen up a little bit, so I can do one more stretch and fold on it. When it's cold in the refrigerator, it's a little tighter. After about an hour at room temperature, you're gonna do one more of the lift, tuck, stretch, fold process. And then you're going to shape your bread into a sandwich loaf. So you're gonna get your sandwich loaf baking dish, and you're going to basically roll your bread into that kind of shape. You wanna use your fingers to tuck at the bottom of the bread, kind of pulling it on your countertop so you're creating a tight knot on the bottom of the bread into that vertical shape. Then you want to line your sandwich tin with parchment paper and place the bread dough inside. Now you're going to do one more fermenting process for about 2 hours, but you can go as long as 4 hours. If it's really hot out that day, I wouldn't do more than 2 hours. If it's not that hot out, like in the 60s, you're fine with 4 hours. I have done 8 hours before and it has over fermented. So you don't want to go too long here, but again, this is the process that's scientific, so it's not exact measurements and exact timing, but 2 to 3 hours would be great. After that 2 to 3 hours of fermenting, it's time to finally bake our bread. We're going to preheat the oven to 375 degrees. And of course, you're going to uncover your bread and put it in the oven at 375 for 30 minutes. You're looking for the top to become golden brown, but not dark brown. Then remove your bread from the oven. You're going to carefully transfer it to a cooling rack and let it sit for at least an hour. It will continue cooking at this point. You'll probably hear it kind of crackling, so it's important to not interrupt that. All right, now you have your very own seeded whole grain sourdough sandwich bread. I hope you and your family enjoy this. I just love slicing it up, putting it in the toaster, spreading butter and my homemade jelly with it, packing eggs over the top, fried eggs with the yolk. We enjoy this with sandwiches, so many things, and I know that you will love it too. For the full recipe, check out the blog, theduvallhomestead.com. There'll be a printable version as well. It's very easy to just print, and you can save it in your recipe book for later. If you're brand new to my page, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Every week I post a new video on farm-to-table recipes and homemade natural living. Thank you so much for stopping by the Duvall Homestead.